is Summer Harvey. I'm so thankful to sit here tonight to speak with all of you. I hope that everyone is staying safe during this time of quarantine. I know it's been really chaotic for everyone. Due to the recent spread of the coronavirus, we have been prohibited from holding live discussions. However, technological advancements have enabled me to still share tonight's TED Talk with you all. A few things about myself before we jump right into discussion. I currently reside in Florida. I plan to become a certified registered nurse anesthesiologist with a few more years of school, that is. And ever since I was a child, I've always been interested in crime shows. It really began as my mom and I just watching Law & Order SVU, then binge watching Criminal Minds all the time. And through my high school years, I found an interest in psychology. It was then when I developed a particular interest in serial killers, and I began to question who these individuals really are and what caused them to do such terrible things. Further interest and intrigue has sparked tonight's discussion on the topic of the psychology of serial killers. I have chosen to focus on the highly debated question of nature versus nurture in these rare individuals. When discussing the topic of serial killers, it is very important that you understand the definition of what a serial killer really is.
According to the Oxford Dictionary, by definition, a serial killer is an individual who murders 3 or more people, often with no apparent motive and typically following a characteristic, predictable behavior pattern.
One of the most common misconceptions is that all psychopaths are serial killers, but a serial killer is not defined as a psychopath.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders classifies a psychopath as an individual incapable of forming emotional attachments. Despite their inability to feel emotions, psychopaths learn to mimic normal emotions. These individuals tend to be aggressive and lack empathy for their actions. An issue still presented in law enforcement and medical settings today is the intertwining use of the terms psychopath and sociopath. Both of these disorders share common behavioral traits but are distinctly different. Unlike psychopaths, sociopaths tend to be nervous and easily agitated. They are volatile and prone to emotional outbursts, including fits of rage. Many sociopaths are able to form an attachment to a particular individual or group, although they have no regard for society or its rules in general.
Determining whether someone is a psychopath or a sociopath is based on the aspects of nature and nurture in the individual. Research has determined psychopathy to be a biological and genetic trait that people are born with. In contrast, sociopathy is developed through childhood experiences and physical and emotional abuse. Serial killers share some common characteristics of impulsiveness, desire for control, and lack of remorse. Though their motives may differ, all serial killers have a compulsion to kill. This irresistible urge is a defining characteristic present in all serial killers. The two contrasting theories of nature and nurture provide an explanation of why serial killers may exist. The first theory I will be discussing is the theory of nurture. This theory suggests that environmental and societal factors heavily influence an individual. This perspective claims that the psychology of serial killers stems from abuse and other traumatic events as a child that may lead to harming animals and oftentimes other people. Factors of nurture cause psychological damage and can lead to an individual who develops different norms and values than the rest of society. This results in serial killers who begin to develop without a moral conscience. Jeffrey Dahmer is a prime example that counteracts the belief that serial killers are born. Dahmer had a perfectly normal childhood, and evidence shows that he experienced no signs of abusive genetic behavior.
Researchers Mitchell and Amott center their studies on the emotional aspects of childhood that are crucial for the proper development of the adult personality. In their studies, they claim that childhood trauma has been linked to the formation of serial killers. Their study consisted of 50 serial killers who were studied to determine the prevalence of childhood abuse in order to create a comparison of serial killers to the general population. For serial killers, the prevalence of physical abuse was 36%, sexual abuse was 26%, and psychological abuse was 50%. abuse of all types, excluding neglect, was significantly higher in the serial killer population. The compendium of these factors leads psychologists to view psychopathic behavior as the brain's defense mechanism against the psychological trauma they endure.
The opposing theory of nature proposes that behavioral traits are innate and a component of human instinct. Over the course of many years, research has been conducted to determine whether serial killers are born with a genetic predisposition. Law student and serial killer researcher Alice Cortland discusses the topic of nature versus nurture in the psychology of serial killers in her article titled Serial Killers Born or Made. In her studies, evidence shows that complications in the brain chemistry of an individual are associated with serial killers and their abnormal behavioral traits.
Scientists have uncovered data that displays frontal lobe brain damage and other genetic disorders are the cause of unexplainable behavior that serial killers exhibit. Research suggests that the frontal lobe of the brain, highlighted in yellow above, is responsible for much of an individual's behavior that enables stable and adequate social relationships. And the amygdala and hippocampus, highlighted above, which comprise the limbic system in these murderers, may be absent or underdeveloped, resulting in uncontrollable acts of anger and aggression. This diagram displays a mid-sagittal view of the brain that enables us to see the entire orbital frontal cortex structure. This structure may be very small, but it plays a large role in our psychology. In 2008, Dr. Richard Davidson led a study in discovering that individuals with lots of aggression have little to no brain activity in the orbital frontal cortex. As well as Davidson, neuroscientist Jim Fallon studied the brains of psychopaths for over 20 years. His studies showed that serial killers never develop a sense of attachment and belonging to the world. Fallon's greatest contribution to uncovering the psychology of serial killers was his discovery that the orbital cortex of the brain is the area that is believed to be involved with ethical behavior, moral decision-making, and impulse control. Lack of activity in the orbital frontal cortex of the brain also affects the anterior cingulate cortex. An individual who has complications in the orbital frontal cortex structure may also experience a decrease of activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. Combination of the orbital frontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex control emotional impulses. Thus, any damage or underdevelopment of these structures will elicit uncontrollable emotional impulses in an individual.
From these studies, psychologists of the nature theory conclude that even though environmental and nurture aspects affect an individual's thoughts, it is the killer's genetic makeup that inevitably creates murderous thoughts. Evidence suggests that nature and the genetics of an individual play a renowned role. If there were no biological influences on the psychology of serial killers, then anyone who experienced childhood trauma or abuse would be a monster. This is entirely illogical. Being susceptible to genetically driven violent conduct does not solely cause someone to become a killer. When genetics as well as environmental factors coexist, they work together to shape a person. Due to the lack of continuous and consistent medical research on the psychology of serial killers and their brain chemistry, we are unable to pinpoint the exact cause for the development of these serial killers. Both theories are proven to be associated with the psychology of serial killers. However, lack of concrete evidence to fully support these theories has been a large issue. It is unverified that just the aspects of nurture or the aspects of nature alone create a serial killer. This has led to my belief that rather than just one or the other, both nature and nurture play a renowned role in the development of serial killers. From this discussion, I hope that you have gained further insight into who these serial killers really are and grasp an understanding of why they may exist, as well as why they elicit such distinct behaviors. Thank you all for coming to my TED Talk tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it.